Chapter 5. Men fear death as children fear to go in the dark, and as that natural fear in children is increased with tales, so is the other. Francis Bacon, of Death. Sim's voice cut through the dark haze of Larson's confusion. Alarum! Alarum, what's the matter? Drawn from the wild surges of memories inspired by Vidar's imaginings, Larson raised his head. Galinar crouched among the pines, patient as a shadow in the pre-dawn mist. Closer, Brender and Silm stood over Larson. The child cocked his head sideways in question. Silm's brow was lined, and concern darkened her blue eyes. For the first time since they had left Forsmore, she regarded Larson with something other than hostility. Just another dream, Larson muttered. He rolled to a sitting position and refastened the sword to his belt. Sweat dripped from his hair. Galinar grunted disinterestedly and returned to his bedding. Brender comforted Larson in a childish soprano. I have nightmares too. I used to lie real close to Uncle Crulian and tell him about them. He said if I told someone, I wouldn't ever have the same bad dream again. Now more accustomed to flashbacks, Larson recovered his composure quickly. He stared at Silm, both pleased and discomforted by her anxious expression. Describe the dream, said the sorceress softly. Your last vision detailed our quest. I don't think, Larson trailed off. Only a fool could surrender such an opportunity. Fine, but I want to talk to you alone. Silm pinched her lip between her fingers. For some time, Larson received no reply except the low-pitched hum of mosquitoes. Eventually, the sorceress nodded assent and gestured toward the brush beyond camp. She passed through the sparse undergrowth with no more noise than a summer breeze. Apprehensively, Larson jumped to his feet and followed her into the twilight haze of the forest. Once beyond sight and sound of their companions, Silm comforted Larson with silent forbearance. Though half hidden in shadow, her face reflected the same distress Larson had recognized at his bedside. The dream? She reminded him politely. Dream, repeated Larson vacantly. Sunrise lit glimmers of gold in Silm's hair. Wind pressed the fabric of her dress tight against her finely sculpted breasts. She held a pose of self-assurance and command, but her eyes imparted interest as well as concern. Suddenly, Larson felt awkward as a teenager on his first date. It seems my sword... A rush of passion spoiled his composure. Silm, I love you, he blurted without preamble. Silm's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. An answering warmth flashed through her eyes and quickly disappeared. Caught in a swirl of joyous emotion at the realization that Silm might actually share his affection, Larson caught her to his chest. Her body went taut as wood against him. Her hand snaked free and lashed across his face. Larson staggered as much from shock as pain, and stared with wide-eyed innocence. How dare you! Silm's indignation cut Larson like a blade. I'll not suffer the touch of a rogue who would worry friends to maneuver a woman alone. She whirled with an anger that whipped her hair to a golden wave and stormed toward the camp. Crushed by Silm's rejection and sick with embarrassment at his brazen approach, Larson rubbed his aching cheek. As the sorceress stomped into the shadows, he called after her in a voice weak with humiliation. Silm, please wait. She continued as if he had not spoken. The details of her retreating form became lost among the trees. Wait! Larson shifted from foot to foot and pressed his one remaining advantage. I want to talk about Vidar. Silm hesitated. Larson continued with a valiant attempt at resolve, which could not hide his tension. I know how to contact Vidar. Silm turned, too concerned about the fate of her god, to ignore any source no matter how unlikely. Her manner was stiff and threatening as a crouched tigress, yet her features held a stunningly feminine vulnerability, which awakened Larson's desires, despite his attempts to hold his emotions in rein. If this is another ruse, I swear I'll kill you, she said coldly. From another woman, the challenge might have seemed ludicrous, but Silm had proven herself quite capable of lethal magics. Larson shivered and pressed his lips in a noncommittal line. It's truth. I've spoken with Vidar. Silm scowled warningly. Quickly, Larson detailed his story, the sequence of mixed reality and illusion which had threaded through his mind since nightfall. As he spoke, Silm's pinched face relaxed to nearly accepting warmth, but her arms remained crossed, and her fists tightened against the fabric of her cloak. From the corner of his eye, Larson caught Silm staring at him with strangely tender sympathy, but whenever he met her glance, she turned her face away, like a star-struck schoolgirl found examining the object of a crash. So, you see, Vidar's been with us all along, Larson swallowed. both confused and intimidated by Selm's odd behavior. I guess I can't expect you to believe me. I'm never quite certain when to believe myself. Larson stopped speaking as he realized proof swung from his hip. He pulled Vavenir from his sheath so abruptly, Selm recoiled. Here, speak with him yourself. He offered the hilt to the sorceress. Larson's mind tingled from a blast like static. An idea glided gently through his thoughts. Alarum, you're the only one who can communicate with me. What? Larson screamed aloud. Selm startled again. What do you mean? He challenged the sword. I said nothing, Selm stammered. Selm's mental defenses are too strong for my intrusions, Vidar explained. I told you before, you lack mind barriers. That's why Frey chose you. Damn. Larson returned the blade to its scabbard, hand heavy against his jeweled hilt. Now what do I tell Selm? Alarum, are you well? Selm reached for Larson. He cringed reflexively, though her touch was gentle on his shoulder. What's happened? Vidar can only speak with me. Grieved by his discovery, Larson did not notice the change in Selm's demeanor. Now you'll never trust me. He spoke more to himself than to the sorceress. Then, in a rush of emotion, he continued quickly. I suppose I really can't blame you, but I have loved you almost since the day we met. When I told you how I felt, hope made me think you returned my affection. I'm sorry I grabbed you, Selm. It was all a stupid misunderstanding. Larson gathered a great breath and released a sigh so loud it nearly obliterated Selm's whispered answer. There was no misunderstanding. Larson caught his breath. What did you say? Selm met Larson's gaze for the first time since he confronted her in the brush. I do love you. She turned away with a lowered head, her face buried in her palms. Larson hovered uncertain. He wanted desperately to hold and comfort Selm, yet memory of her warning stayed him. Touching a sorceress against her will could well prove fatal. Selm looked up. Her eyes were miserably red, yet tearless. Someday, she began with an obvious attempt to be tactful, I want to have children. Confusion strained Larson's smile. That would suit me too. But it can't be with you, Selm continued, and we mustn't start something we can't finish. Larson opened his mouth, but found himself unable to speak. He stared at Selm's face, which seemed to shine like a second sun, as dawn dispelled all darkness but the shadows of trees and ferns. You don't understand. Selm seemed troubled by his ignorance. Larson stroked his sword hilt while he searched his mind for a reply. You're an elf? Selm prodded softly. It always seemed such a simple thing to remember, yet Larson continued to forget he was no longer a man. Doubts rushed upon him like a plague. Once before he had wondered whether elves and humans could interbreed, a question pushed aside by the many adventures and wonders of Selm's world. Now, if he was to believe the sorceress, their union was impossible. But even through a haze of frustration and sorrow, Larson discovered a flaw in his conclusion. He wondered why Selm attempted to dupe him with biological falsehoods. I may be from another world, but I'm not a fool. I know elves and humans can have children together. Your half-brother. Selm wrung her hands with a fresh aura of distress. That's the problem, don't you see? No. Selm paced. Our children would be half-breeds, like Brahmin. No. Larson's denial held the authority of a command. Brahmin's father was a dark elf? His demon blood ruined your brother. Selm stopped, shaking her head vigorously. Brahmin was a good child until the tribes of neighbors poisoned him. Our offspring would fare no better. This world is unprepared for crossbreeds of any type. I'm sorry, Alarum. Resigned, Selm turned and walked solemnly toward camp. Wait! Larson's screamed order stopped Selm in her tracks. Denying love won't make it go away. You can't turn it off and on like a light switch. Afraid to speak too boldly and anger Selm, Larson pursed his lips and kept the remainder of his thoughts hidden. How can you condemn the citizenry of Forstmore for their treatment of Brahmin, when your own prejudice transcends love? Desperately, he continued. By his appearance, Brender's a half-breed of Scandinavian and some darker race, and Galinar's a full-bred foreigner. Lights? Which? Selm seemed confused by Larson's tirade. She folded her arms across her chest and did not bother to face him. They're both human, and Galinar can silence teasing. So can we. Larson's voice cracked as he sought to make his point before he lost Selm forever. We can protect our children. Selm pursed her lips and said nothing, nor did she move when Larson came up behind her and made his final plea. I'm good enough for your god, Selm. Why else would Frey have chosen me to save him? The sorceress turned slowly. And once we free Vidar, every human in Midgard would respect us and our offspring. Larson stared, not daring to believe the uncertainty which softened Selm's tone. He met her gaze. Warmth replaced the menacing coldness which had marred the beauty of her eyes. He caught her to his chest. Her presence drove aside all memory of the biting winds. She returned his embrace wholeheartedly, without trace of her former reluctance. Her slim hand sent shivers of desire through him, inducing his mind to conjure a third world between the archaic fantasy of Midgard and his nightmares of Vietnam. It encompassed only Selm and himself, a slim shadow of reality which would hazard no intruders. Wind ruffled the foliage which defined the clearing, but Larson remained blind and deaf to everything except Selm. He wound his fingers in the soft waves of her hair, savoring her beauty now promised to him by love. Selm's hesitation changed his existence as suddenly as had death. Since his enlistment, the bliss of sleep melting to reality each morning filled his mind with dread, but from now, the rising sun must reawaken euphoric memories of Selm, and even after the initial intensity of the relationship faded, Selm's fierce loyalty to causes would bind them for as long as an elf and a sorceress might live. Thrilled to the elation of love long denied, Larson pressed his lips to Selm's and explored her mouth with his tongue. He desired to know her like a treasured story, which, read 1,000 times, would never lose its magic. He studied her with his eyes, hands, and mind, dreading at any moment that she might stiffen and grow cold to him, but it never came. Selm's answering warmth intensified their kiss until Larson withdrew for fear of losing control of his passion so close to camp, and driving Selm away with boldness. "She loves me!" Joy exploded within him. Gradually Larson's narrow ribbon of world expanded, and realization crowded him. He recalled Selm's earlier reluctance and her words which seemed so simple, yet nearly formed an impenetrable wall between them. "Someday I want to have children." The accusation in her voice triggered memories, plunging Larson deeper into his flawed mental tapestry. Poised at the edge of sanity, he brushed aside the plaintive visages of slant-eyed orphans. The effort flung him further into his past, to an age when he welcomed rather than feared the night. Though discomforting, his vision held none of the terror usually inherent in flashback. Soft and vague as a whisper, he revived the porcelain doll features of his young brother Timmy, as they sat before the headstone of their father's grave. The haze of gathering night hid the tears in the child's eyes, but his voice emerged as a quavering whine. "Why? Why did he have to die? Why would he go to heaven and leave us?" His plea faded in the stillness. In his memory, Al Larson scuffed his shoe in the dust, fighting his own sorrow for an answer. "He loved us, Timmy. God took him. God and his drunk driver." Larson's present thoughts twisted the past. "Dad didn't want to leave us. No one chooses to die. No one but Annalise D." Again, the Larson in Midgard amended his imaginings. This observation opened other channels of memory. He recalled the day he left for boot camp, plagued by doubts yet morbidly excited by the glamour of espionage and the challenge of matching wits with other men. While in a zone of peace, distant dangers enticed him, but this thrill shattered before the hollow glare of betrayal he found in Timmy's eyes. Larson realized suddenly his brother had never said goodbye. A tear formed in Larson's eye, blurring his image of Timmy. Joy fled before an onrush of resolve. Lost in the promise of passion, I dared to believe I could raise a child. I cannot subject some kid to my insanity, or the consequences of flashback. Every person I care for becomes a weapon for my enemies. A child will not join my life until I learn to control my thoughts, and I can't allow myself to love Selm until we vanquish Brahmin. Larson dropped his hands to his sides, and his index finger traced a gem in Velvetneer's hilt. Vidar's voice crashed into his mind. "You hypocrite! Now who thinks of controlling love? Are you selfish or merely stupid?" Anger speared through the pathways of Larson's mind, and he winced beneath the onslaught of emotion. Denying love won't protect you from grief, and fatherhood is more than ancestry. You already have a child. Brender cares deeply for you. Does the camaraderie you shared in Forsmar mean nothing to you? If you reject Brender like you did Timmy, you'll destroy his trust completely. "Alarum?" Selm caught Larson's arm. Larson shoved the sword hilt aside, and Vidar's presence fled his mind, leaving ghostly echoes in its wake. "I never abandoned Timmy. I did what I had to do. Do you think I wanted to go to war?" He battered aside the nagging memory of his brother's face, replaced it with others, his sister Pam, Ty's son, Brender. Each had experienced the greatest trauma chance could perpetrate upon a child, the loss of a parent. Like Timmy, all three returned to life with a resilience Larson could scarcely comprehend. Innocents caught in a world without mercy. They came to me with trust and hope, and I betrayed them all. Damn it, I do love Brender. He needs me. He shall become our first child. Silm seized Larson's hands and chided gently. Of course we will raise Brender. Did you think I'd abandon a partially trained apprentice who knows just enough of magic to endanger himself? Not realizing he had spoken aloud, Larson shied. Relaxing, he smiled. Again he pulled Silm to him, content with the pressure of her body against his. His thoughts remained in a lazy stupor of complacence. Stolen in death from a world at war, Frey seemed to have given him everything. Life in a new world, a woman more beautiful than a fairy tale princess, and a child who, if a bit inept, reminded him of himself in youth and might one day inherit great power. Silm continued speaking softly in his ear. Naturally, I still think it best to leave Brender safely in a town until our conflict with Brahmin is completed. A battlefield is no place for a boy. Larson agreed. Before he could reply, Galenar's gruff baritone interrupted their embrace. Alarum, time for your lesson. Muttering blasphemies from his own world, Larson released Silm. He knew from past experience it was as unhealthy to ignore Galenar as a rearing cobra. For several seconds the elf stood, touching only Silm's fingertips. See you at breakfast? Of course, she replied, as if that had always been her habit. Hand in hand, they returned to camp. Sunlight spilled through the clouds, coloring the river silk like gilt, but Larson was too preoccupied to notice. Feet soaked by dew, he followed Galenar's instructions with a renewed enthusiasm, which pleased his teacher. Good, Alarum. You've learned to treat your sword as a friend rather than an obstacle. Again. Laughing inwardly at the unwitting double meaning of Galenar's praise, Larson repeated the maneuver. Valventnir crashed solidly against Akensi's notched wooden blade. Momentarily, Larson's attention strayed to Silm, who watched his practice with approval. Enough. Galenar followed the direction of Larson's stare. Work will make a swordsman of you. For now, your interests are elsewhere. Smiling, Larson sheathed his sword. Drying sweat intensified the late morning chill as he strode to Silm and took her arm. Returning to the campfire, they found Brender sorting a sack of rations. The four travelers breakfasted together for the first time in more than a week. Glad for company, Brender prattled in an unending childish banter. More attentive to Silm's hand, Larson heard little of the conversation until the sorceress spoke. Yes, Brender's done well. He's learned the spell I promised to teach him. The child beamed as Silm continued. I recognize this land. The town of Manival lies a half-day ahead. I have friends there who would gladly watch Brender while we complete our quest. Brender's smile vanished, replaced by a grimace of horror. Watch! You can't leave me. You just can't. His eyes pleaded with Larson. Galenar nodded in tacit agreement with Silm's plan. Unable to meet Brender's eyes, Larson took a sudden, inordinate interest in his meal. Brender leaped to his feet. His unfinished apple tumbled to the dirt. I won't go. I won't. I won't. When this tactic gained no sympathy, the child changed to another. Alarum? He knelt beside Larson and squeezed the elf's arm with grubby fists. Please, Al. Please? Larson closed his eyes as the image of another child took vivid form in his memory. Ty's son's voice rang clear as reality. Candy Joe? A small hand tugged at his fatigues. Larson heard himself reply, his voice stiff with feigned offense. You know my name, T-son. The child amended. Candy Al? Please, Al? All right, okay. Larson thrust a hand into his pocket and retrieved a packet wrapped in crisp, clean paper. T-son watched with a bright-eyed excitement which made Larson smile. Slowly, he peeled away the wrapper to reveal a piece of chocolate melted nearly to liquid. Thanks, thanks! The child accepted the offering and soon coated his fingers and mouth with candy. Gavin called from farther along the road. Al, you coming? Larson turned. Light flashed through his thoughts like a warning. Suddenly, he realized he was caught in flashback as fully as a shallow sleeper knows when he is dreaming. Memory crowded him solid as brick. Larson struggled against re-experiencing the catastrophe he could not bear a second time. He tried to force his mind from T-son a dozen times with no success. Madness engulfed his conscious thought, pushing his mind back toward a village in Vietnam and the chocolate-stained child with the beatific smile. Larson staggered. His hand cracked painfully against steel. Inadvertently, he seized Valventnar's hilt, and another consciousness merged with his own. With Vidar's aid, Larson escaped his flashback, none the worse for his vision, except for sweat-slicked palms and a shiver which racked his entire body. Brender clung to Larson's shirt, his entreaties muffled by folds of cloth. Larson mentally communicated profuse gratitude to Vidar, then turned his attention to the child at his chest. "Brender, I like you very much." The child tightened his grip. "Enough so," Larson continued, "that I want to keep you as a son." The words sounded hollow to Larson's ears. Even 9 months in Vietnam had not aged him enough to have a 10-year-old child. Al Larson was only 20, but I can't know the age of this elf body in which Frey placed me. According to fairy tales, elves are immortal. If that holds true, the point becomes assuredly moot. Larson forced his thoughts from this new distraction. "I won't have you killed because of my task. You stay in Manival, Brender. I won't apologize for caring enough to keep you safe." Brender made no reply, but his mouth puckered to a scowl, and he moved away with a tread sufficiently heavy to convey betrayal. Haunted by remembrances of a Vietnamese boy who became a casualty in the affairs of men, Larson paid the sorceress's apprentice no heed. He helped Silm and Galinar pack the horses, believing his decision a wise one. The journey to the town of Manival convinced Larson of the soundness of his choice to side with Silm and Galinar. In an attempt to sway the lenient elf who had already proven himself a child's easy mark, Brender became Larson's self-appointed servant. The boy volunteered to carry Larson's supplies on his own horse, dismounted to retrieve a cape pin the elf dropped, and offered to groom all the steeds at their next encampment. Larson supposed Brender would have eaten, drunk, and pissed for him if given the opportunity. Since Galinar recognized a change in Larson's and Silm's relationship, he rode ahead on the pretext of scouting, but Brender's constant presence made even simple exchanges of affection impossible. By the time the travelers reached the outskirts of Manival, Larson could scarcely wait to be free of the boy. Brender fell distressingly silent as they entered the town. Larson recalled the first time his mother had left him in the home of a strange babysitter. Then he had clung to his mother, overwhelmed by the irrational fear she would never return. Sensing his discomfort, his mother had entrusted him with a necklace she wore every day. Though it was senseless to think she would abandon him and not her jewelry, the gesture consoled him. At the time, Larson had been considerably younger than Brender. He knew a token far more valuable than a silver chain would be required to reassure the healer's nephew. The moment Larson and his companions reached the town proper, peasants converged on Silm like groupies in the presence of a rock star. Disquieted by the gathering crowd, Larson, Galinar, and Brender shied away from the sorceress's admirers. Dickensi explained in a whisper. "Years ago, Brahman sent a dragon after Silm. After a long and arduous battle, she defeated the worm near the town of Manival. Naturally, the citizenry was convinced she rescued them from the beast, and, in all fairness, she probably did. Once Silm recovered from her confrontation, she hired me as a bodyguard." Larson nodded, only partially listening as he pondered a means to comfort Brender. His only item of value was Velvetnir, but he could not hand the sword to the boy and still complete his quest. Galinar's katana and shota were surely off limits, and Larson doubted Silm would surrender her dragon staff to a novice magician, though she had often left it in Galinar's care. A tarp-covered wagon creaked past Larson and stopped before the throng which surrounded Silm. A man reined in the horse while a plump woman dragged a freckle-faced girl toward the sorceress who was already engaged in an inordinate number of simultaneous conversations. A gust of wind swirled a few dusty feathers from the wagon, and the woeful clucks of its live cargo gave Larson an idea. He placed an arm about Brender's slumped shoulders and addressed Dickensi. "How many days of travel do we have left?" Galinar kept his gaze on Silm, though she surely had nothing to fear from her reverent crowd of townsfolk. "A half-day to the Oracle, and the same back to the river, then 1 more day on the Valleys of Darkness, and then Hellspring." "And another to return to Manival for Brender," Larson finished. "How much food do we have?" Galinar scratched his leg through the layers of his windspread ropes. 4, maybe 5 days. "Good," said Larson, with surprisingly effective finality. "Just enough to reach our goal and get us back to Brender. We won't buy any rations here." He smiled at the child. Without supplies or a nearby town, Larson and his companions would be forced to return to Manival to secure food or go hungry. Galinar looked away from Silm to confront Larson. His glower made it clear he understood Larson's intentions, and equally apparent that they displeased him. "We may be delayed." Larson remained adamant. "Unless we're killed, we can make it back in 5 days. Galinar rattled his fingers against the sheath of his katana impatiently. "I consider death a more extreme delay." He met Brender's stricken stare and relented. "Fine, no rations. But I'm certain Brender knows I could think of better ways to be rid of a young wizard. then leaving him in a town, with my name and description, to wreak future vengeance. Galinar patted his sword pommel to make his pronouncement perfectly clear. Still staring at the boy, Dickensi pointed at the adoring peasants and changed the topic. Brender, Silma's many friends in Manaval. If you ever wanted to become a silversmith or a baker or a copper, let her know. I want to be a wizard. Brender's pout was uncompromising. And? Galinar asked as if the child had not finished. Just a wizard? Brender jerked his head with resolution. Wizards are the smartest people in the world. Galinar laced his fingers on his chin as he pondered a situation which had grown more complex than he anticipated. Larson tried to help. What's so special about wizards? Brender answered without hesitation. Wizards make magic, and they know more than anyone else. More than silversmiths and coppers? Larson asked, though he was unfamiliar with the latter occupation and could only guess at its meaning. Brender nodded. Larson winked at Galinar. Then I guess you already know how to fashion jewelry and, shoe horses. Well, no. Galinar chuckled at Larson's misinterpretation of a copper's profession. Did your Uncle Crullian know how to, shoe horses? Brender bit his lip and nodded assent. As does Silm, Galinar finished. Wizards are supposed to understand simple things like that. He cast a furtive glance towards Silm, who had already begun working her way through them toward the crowd. Dickensi's voice dropped to a whisper as he addressed the child again. Lucky for you. Silm never discovered your gap in your education, or she wouldn't have let you become her apprentice. You've only 5 days to correct your serious deficiency. But don't worry, we won't tell her. The swordmaster clamped a hand over his mouth in mock conspiracy, as Silm dispersed the throng and returned to her companions. We won't have any problem finding a temporary home for Brender. Silm jabbed the road dirt with the base of her dragon staff. I've found more than enough volunteers. Galinar winked at no one in particular. Brender has requested a 5-day apprenticeship with the blacksmith. Fine choice, she said to the boy. I'm certain Sigurdur would appreciate your company. She led her companions through a town smaller and poorer than Forsmore, stopping occasionally to exchange greetings and introductions. Larson met scores of blondes and redheads with names which required spelling out. He found that most had final pronounced E's or silent R's and promptly forgot all of them. For their part, the townsfolk spared Larson more than his share of stares, but he recognized none of the hostility against elves he had received in Silm's hometown. He wondered how much Silm's presence might have altered the events in Aura's tavern. Larson heard the crash of hammer against anvil long before they rounded the corner of Sigurdur's house. They found the blacksmith intent on a bent strip of steel, his honey-colored beard sweat plastered to his chin. Back to the newcomers, a youngster a few years older than Brender worked the bellows with an effort which grew sloppy with fatigue. Yo, Eirik! Sigurdur bellowed at the boy. He raised his head, caught sight of Silm, and stopped in mid-yell. Silm! He gestured her forward with an exaggerated wave. Sigurdur examined his works briefly, dismayed to find only horseshoes, barrel hoofs, and a wood-cutting axe, none of which seemed the proper gift for a lady. Eirik released the bellows with a relieved sigh and shook cramps from his arms, while the blacksmith introduced his son Eirik, and Silm presented her companions. Brender clung to Larson, despite the fact that the elf was every bit as inexperienced as himself. Eirik greeted Brender with so much exuberance, the healer's nephew regained sufficient confidence and interest to release Larson and speak. I'm a wizard! Eirik's features twisted in awe. Sigurdur nodded encouragement. Silm, you and your distinguished companions must stay for dinner and the night. Kelda's prepare lamb stew with goat's milk cheese. She always makes enough for a boatload of warriors, and we've plenty of room. He waved his guests toward the door of the cottage without waiting for confirmation. For the first time, Larson noticed the streaks of gray in the sky which heralded sunset. The gnawing in his gut, which he had attributed to the anxiety of entering the town, became a tense grumble of hunger. They had traveled right through without passing for lunch. Eagerly he followed Silm and Brender through the cottage door, into the welcoming aroma of gravy and fresh-baked bread. Galinar bowed politely to his hosts. Forgive me, Sigurdur blacksmith. Lord Alarum and I cannot attend your meal. We've a sword lesson to complete. Larson turned suddenly and reluctantly from the feast. Now? But there's food on the table. Galinar bowed again, but his words were without compromise. Practice. Now. Excuse me, Larson mumbled to their host. He found abandoning dinner for swordplay painful, but he followed Dickensi across the brown grasses of the blacksmith's lawn to an open area beyond the forge. An edge of the sun had already slipped beneath the horizon, coloring the western sky as red as the blood in Vidar's vision. Larson scowled as he reached for his sword. "You're one hell of a gung-ho gook." "Pardon me?" Galinar's hand paused on the brocade of his katana. "Nothing," Larson sighed, enjoying the sound of English in this legendary northern world. "But where I come from, it's impolite to refuse dinner with a host." Galinar nodded once, his eyes dark as midnight. "Hero, if you miss a meal tonight, you will have another tomorrow." He paused as the air hummed with the first of the evening's mosquitoes. "If you skip practice, you may not. Begin." Larson obeyed with reluctant annoyance. In 2 days he would face the greatest challenge of his new life with nothing but the knowledge of a few dodges and strikes. Surely, one lesson more or less would make little difference to his abilities. But Galinar seemed to think otherwise, and Larson found it impossible to argue with the swordmaster concerning his own trade. Galinar worked Larson without mercy far into the moonless night. For each success, Dickensi presented a new challenge until Larson's annoyance folded beneath all-encompassing fatigue. More and more frequently, he relied on Vidar's cues. By the time the practice concluded, without ceremony or praise, Larson no longer wanted food, just a place to lie down and a full night's rest. Galinar and Larson returned to the cottage in a silence which pleased the elf. Condemning words or maxims would have rekindled the exasperation he struggled to suppress. Inside, Galinar joined the conversation of Silm, Sigurdur, and Kelda, who shared tea before a roaring fire. Larson excused himself with a yawn, and Kelda showed him to a bedroom with a straw pallet and a hand-knitted quilt. There, Larson promptly fell asleep. The dream seized control of Larson during the shallow twilight slumber near to awakening. It began as a pleasant vision of the extension of their journey. Galinar, Silm, and himself rode along a meandering path beside the river Silg, which twisted like a river serpent, widening to a torrent of ice-flecked waters. The trail forked many times. Always in the past they had taken the branch which most closely paralleled the river. But in the dream, Silm indicated a wooden sign corroded by fungus and started down a side path, which led away from the stream. As the dream Larson turns to follow, panic seized him like an overdose of adrenaline. He dismounted and dropped to a crouch, heart hammering in his chest, his mouth dried to rawness, his vision blurred to haze. War memories pressed toward expression, but the being who inspired his nightmare wove barriers with the intricacy of a spider. In the vision, Larson shook his head with uncharacteristic violence and gestured toward the northern trail along the river Silg. There was no sound in Larson's dream, but when Silm cleared slime from the road sign, its writings became clear. Temple to Odin, the Oracle of Hargatar. With an air of exasperation, Silm and Galinar reined their horses down the eastward branch. Reluctantly, the dream Larson remounted and followed, but with each hoof-fall his anxiety trebled. Rows of twisted juniper passed unnoticed. The scenery might have been painted backdrops for all the heed he paid it. Instead, his attention focused on the looming gray outline of the temple to Odin. By the time Larson and his companions reached the temple dooryard, his clothing had adhered to his sweat-soaked torso. He paused, studying the squat structure with an aura of mistrust. Brown ivy swarmed its exterior in uneven clumps, making it seem to lean awkwardly to the left. Moss chinked the wall stones like green mortar. Larson almost expected to see a lightning flare between non-existent watchtowers. He shivered, wondering whether to blame the temple's eerie appearance, or his heightened senses, for the fear which coiled his muscles nearly to immobility. He felt like a traitor who had refused both cigarette and blindfold before the firing squad. At Silm's knock, the ancient door swung open with a squeal of complaint. A half-dozen drab-robed acolytes met Larson and his companions, and escorted them past stained altars. Beyond, a dark curtain crisscrossed with glimmering silver threads spanned a doorway from ceiling to floor. Galinar and Silm passed through a slit in the fabric. Larson followed them into a room as gray as the moment before dawn. At its farthest end sat the Oracle of Hargatar, a young woman with a seemingly endless cascade of reddish hair. Though shadowed beyond recognition of detail, her face seemed not quite normal to Larson. Before her stood a marble slab which supported a clear oblong diamond with a black central core rimmed green. Not unlike a giant eye, the stone winked and shone with an intensity which further shattered the dream Larson's confidence. Silm stepped forward and presented a request Larson could not hear in the frustratingly soundless world of his dream. The oracle passed a withered hand twice across the diamond. Mist swirled in the depths of the gemstone, floated upward in lines tenuous as heat haze. Abruptly, the oracle burst into a conflagration of yellow flame. Larson reeled backward as a shapeless black form leaped from the fire and attacked the startled sorceress. Claws rent Silm's flesh. Blood sprayed the room in arcs of red chaos. Galinar howled. His swords reflected highlights of scarlet and gold. Valvetnir rasped from its sheath. Larson and Galinar lunged together for the demon which savaged Silm. The beast's claws carved searing lines across Larson's arm, but steel also met its mark. Valvetnir plunged deep into the monster's gut. Even more swiftly, Galinar's stores went sticky green with demon blood. It fell, witch-screaming, across Silm's lifeless form. The room was awash with color. No life remained in Silm's broken body. The sapphire in her dragon staff shattered like glass on the cold stone floor. Grief struck Larson in a wave of mental anguish. As he stared at the wild waste of multiple hues, the scene swirled and blurred away to a single black face with glowing red eyes. Brahmin. Rationality escaped in a rush of fear, and sound sundered silence in a rolling thunderclap of evil laughter. Brahmin's misshapen mouth formed words which struck like daggers of ice. Be forewarned, Al Larson. Should you choose to seek the oracle, you will pay with the lives of friends. Brahmin's face winked out. His dark hand remained and scattered the carefully placed barriers in Larson's mind. Memories burst forth like a torrent through a broken dam. Rockets flared from every angle with roars which deafened Larson. Bullets whined in insect-like swarms where he cowered with no safe place to retreat. Screams formed a chorus of hell-born agonies, while ghosts of buddies and enemies alike sentenced Larson to an eternity of life. Larson's mental flight from madness ran him headlong into a scene from the past. He crouched between the banks of a dried river, clutching an M16 which grew surprisingly light in the moments before death. Surrounded by enemies, he charged from the banks with Frey's name on his lips. But where the last time he had recalled nothing except awakening in a strange elf body and a foreign world, now he recalled the torment of bullets riddling his body, jerking his limbs like a marionette. Horror held him screamless, while a river of his own blood washed between the banks. Larson awoke with sinews knotted and no sense of place or time. He was on his feet before he could think, eyes searching the room for movement. He scuttled to a corner and pressed his back to the wall. Sanity returned him to the blacksmith's cottage. Larson took several deep breaths, rose, and paced until his muscles uncoiled, and his mood passed from panic to anxiety to crimson fury against a half-breed hellion who sought Silm's soul. Brahmin! Larson called with a courage he'd never before known he possessed. I don't fear your threats, your dragons, your demons, or your— Short of insults, he ended lamely, your piddling wang-doodles. Torment me as you wish, but we will visit this oracle. If you could kill Galinar or Silm, I think you would have done so already. Larson believed his challenge was heard by no one except himself, but a shadow fell across the room, and the walls were suddenly diffused with a faint white glow. Caught in the center of the chamber, Larson spun like a fox between two packs of dogs. A message burned through his mind. You underestimate me, future spawn. A long, black finger probed his thoughts for a painful memory. Prepared to fight though he saw no physical threat, Larson freed Valvetnir. Instantly, a benevolent entity joined the intruder in his mind. Brahmin's mental presence hissed a shocked epithet and departed. Vidar's reassurances pervaded Larson's consciousness. Then the god too disappeared to Larson's perception. Before the startled elf could ponder the significance of the night's events, Galinar poked his head through the door to Larson's chamber. Practicing hero. Good. You should be ready for your lesson. After the sword practice, Larson found his stomach too knotted for food despite his 24-hour fast. The conversations of his companions passed unheard as Larson made the decision not to describe his dream to Silm. Too proud to reverse his decision about the oracle, he saw no reason to trouble the sorceress with Brahmin's untenable threats. Still, time passed in an interminable vacuum. Larson was glad when he exchanged his final farewells and promises with Brender. In bleary silence, he passed through the remainder of the town with Silm and Galinar, and continued along the pine-bordered banks of the river Silg. The path looked distressingly similar to Larson's nightmare. Discomforted, he unsheathed Valvetnir and balanced the blade across his knees. His stilted replies to Silm's attempts at conversation frustrated the sorceress and earned him a lonely trip. Still, midday came far too soon for Larson. The sun hovered overhead when Silm drew up her mount at the road sign to the Oracle of Hargater. Galanar reined his mount and addressed Larson for the first time since his lesson. "You must be hungry. Sorry to go against your wishes not to pack supplies, but Lady Kelda offered fresh meat for our journey. I couldn't refuse. Gather some kindling, and we'll have the best cooked lunch of our wanderings." Glad for any distraction which differentiated events of reality from those of his nightmare, Larson clambered from his saddle, sheathed his sword, and wandered into the woods. Twigs were plentiful on the forest floor. Larson selectively collected only the driest ones of a reasonable length. A mere 100 yards from the crossroads, he had managed to accumulate a thick handful of kindling, and he started back toward his waiting companions. Brush crackled behind Larson. He whirled, sticks scattering from his grip, in time to watch a small, familiar figure scuttle behind a clump of trees. "Brender!" Larson screamed. He charged after the retreating child. Brender crashed awkwardly through the weeds. Slower, Larson trailed with far more stealth. Ragweed and ferns gave way to brushless clearing enclosed by intertwining pine. Larson stopped, afraid the chase might already have taken him dangerously far from camp. "Brender, come out now. I know you're here and I'm not playing games," he added with a gentle sigh. "I promise not to hit you." The child's blunderings transformed to softer rustlings. Within moments, Brender emerged from the brush and stepped among the shadows of the clearing. His clothing was torn. Small scratches beneath dripped blood. He shuffled toward Larson like a disobedient dog, his head bent low in shame, his eyes oddly vacant. At a subtle noise from behind, Larson looked around to see Silm, who had followed his calls to the edge of the clearing. He conveyed his control of the situation with a nearly imperceptible nod, and returned his attention to the approaching child. Less than an arm's length separated Larson and Brender when Silm screamed, "Alarum! Wait!" Enchantments bright as a flare struck the child and rebounded to glowing streamers. Silm's magics appeared to have no effect on the boy, but his backlash sparked light from a jagged blade clenched in his fist. Even as Larson recoiled in shock, Brender plunged his knife at the elf's chest. Reflexively, Larson caught the tiny wrist. Brender's other hand enwrapped Larson's free forearm with a power he had never demonstrated in the past. The child's strength was awesome despite his size. Larson strained until sweat sprang from his face. The dagger shivered ever closer. "No!" A beam of amber screened past Larson's ear and struck Brender full in the face. Impact jerked the child backward. Desperate, Larson planted his foot on Brender's knee and rolled onto his back. Stone bit into his spine. The child flipped over Larson, but his vice-like grip held. Brender's fingers pinned Larson's wrist to the ground. The dagger sped for the elf's bared throat. "Brender, no!" Larson struggled like a madman. He seized Brender's knife hand, but all his effort scarcely slowed the blade's descent. Enchantments whizzed over Larson's head, plastering Brender with multiple barbs of energy. The child flinched. Pain blanked his features as the magics ripped through his body and pitched him backward in a mass of bloody tatters. Larson heaved aside the limp figure and sprang to his feet, staring at the gruesome lump of flesh which was once a beloved companion. Brender's eyes seemed glazed as marbles, and his blood-flecked hair spread in an inky puddle. Memory slapped Larson, heavy and unforgiving as a migraine. To Larson's mind, the clearing became a dirt road through a Vietnamese village. The burst of sorcery transformed to the cruel bladder of an M16. The child's face was no longer Brender's. The eyes slanted away from almond-colored irises. The mouth gaped, smeared with melted chocolate. "T-Son!" Larson's stomach lurched, his vision clouded to red haze. He turned hollow, accusing eyes on his buddy, Gavin, who still clutched his smoking gun. Profanity spilled from Larson's throat in an anguished sob. Blood fury raged like fever. He threw himself upon Gavin, swinging his fist with irrational, aimless outrage. Many hands caught Larson. Men pinned him helplessly between uniformed bodies. Larson shrieked as he struggled. The fingers which bruised his arms caused a pain which only fueled his anger. Several seconds went by while Gavin carefully flipped T-Son's remains, and several more passed before Larson recognized the significance of the grenade, which rolled from the child's limp hand. "It was him or you stupid bastard," Gavin explained with a wretched sob. "Him or you." The flashback broke to midday light. As Larson passed from one world to another, he discovered his fist poised to strike a figure already grounded by his blows. From nowhere, Galanar's hand seized his wrist and whipped his body to the ground with surprising speed. The Kenzie's grip barred Larson's arm at an awkward angle. his other hand neatly caged Larsen's throat. Larsen knew Galinar could fracture an arm or windpipe with a single strike. Larsen lay perfectly still. His knuckles felt raw, and his wrist was bruised from Brender's attack. "I'm sorry," he whispered hoarsely. Galinar's grip eased slightly. Sylm knelt at Larsen's side. Blood trickled from the side of her mouth, and Larsen realized with a sudden rush of horror that she was the victim of his own crazed assault. "Oh my God, what have I done?" Galinar released Larsen. The elf staggered to his feet, strengthened nearly to violence by the need for apology. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Larsen repeated it 20 times before humiliation broke his grip, and he turned away with self-loathing. "Finish the quest without me." Larsen unhooked Valvanir and let the sword drop to the ground. "I could have killed her." "I assure you, you couldn't have." Galinar drew to Larsen's side. "Hero." "I'm not a hero." Larsen's screamed reply echoed between gangling pines and warped juniper. "I'm a raving lunatic, a madman, a paranoid maniac with illusions of sanity." When he ran out of Norse descriptions, he switched to English slang. Galinar waited until the tirade passed and spoke with the sincerity he usually reserved for sword practice. "All heroes are flawed." Larsen whirled abruptly. "Heroes? Flawed?" "All heroes," Galinar repeated. "To have courage, a man must know fear. Good cannot exist without evil, and a man becomes a hero when he excels despite his flaws." Larsen hesitated, mentally drained of emotion. Sylm took his hands gently. "Hero, you are forgiven. I can't blame you for avenging the child, even against me. You couldn't know he was not the same Brender we loved. Only my training as enchantress enabled me to recognize Brahman's influence when I reached the clearing." "Then, Brender?" Larsen's voice quivered with hope. Sylm turned her gaze to her feet. "He's dead, Alarum. Brahman would need to destroy him completely to gain control of his body. I'm as sorry as you." Larsen hugged Sylm again, grieved by the loss of a friend, who was as a son, and scarcely daring to believe the sorceress's unbounding compassion. While Larsen recovered his poise, Galinar set Brender's body to pyre. It was only a formality. Brender's automaton was a soulless shell no more worthy of dignity than a fallen sapling. Even so, Brender's corpse left the world with a whispered eulogy and the Kensee's priceless respect. As the 3 companions solemnly mounted horses and reined toward the Oracle of Hargater, Larsen confronted Galinar with a question. "Kensee, what's your flaw?" Galinar's lips bent to a slight smile. "I, Lord Alarum, am no hero."